Welcome, Kindreds and Seekers. I am Jessica Starr and I am your mentor for this month on the Witchcraft Way. I'm really excited and happy to be here. If you haven't met me before, as I said, I'm Jessica. I am a witch, a Welsh folk witch is how I usually describe myself. I've been practicing since my early teens, which is about 3 decades ago now. Don't work out how old that makes me. And my path is mainly based in my land and my heritage. So I was really happy when the Witchcraft Way reached out to me and asked me if I would speak about Beltane, the Fires of Beltane. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history and the customs of Beltane and things like how to celebrate at this time, because I know that's one of the things that a lot of people want to know, especially when people are new to the path. It's like, what should I be doing? Because with witchcraft, there's not like a set path the same as there is with lots of other religions and practices. So, like knowing what to do at different times is something that people are very keen to do. So I will definitely be covering that. We'll be talking a little bit about the history of Beltane as well, and some of the ways which modern celebrations are different from how they would have been originally. And one of the main things that I want to share with you is about how to make your practice really authentic, relating to you as a person and as a witch, and also to where you are in the world. And so I will be talking about things that are perhaps not like kind of traditionally Beltane specific, or even like stereotypically Beltane, because it's become a little bit like that sometimes with the festivals. It's like, oh, at this time you do this, this and this, at this time you do, even though those things are kind of divorced from what is actually happening around you. So like if you're in the southern hemisphere, then nearly everything which is being shared about what Beltane is all about is not really going to resonate for you at that time of year where you are. So that is one of the things I want to talk about as well in this video, and I'm sure there'll be other things because I tend to, talk about things quite a lot. So let's dive into it. Beltane, as we celebrate it today as neo-pagans, has been derived mainly from Gerald Gardner's kind of Wiccan Sabbath's Wheel of the Year. It's one of the 8 spokes on the wheel. The story kind of goes that Gerald Gardner, who is the kind of grandfather or founder of Wicca back in the 50s and 60s, was in a conversation with, I've forgotten his name now, the guy who was like the head of the Neo-Druids at that time as well. And the Wiccan Sabbats, as Gerald wanted to celebrate them, were the ones that were based on the old Gaelic festivals of Beltane and Lughnasa and Samhain, and Imbolc. And the Druids like to celebrate the solstices and the equinoxes, and they couldn't agree on which was like the best way forward for their kind of the concept of neo-paganism. And so they kind of melded those two things together, and that's how we get the neo-pagan Wheel of the Year as we have it now, with the 8 festivals. So we've got the fire festivals, which are based on the old Gaelic Celtic festivals, and then we've also got the solstices and equinoxes. And even though sometimes I like to be quite I'm a bit fastidious sometimes in my practice, and I like things to be like kind of historically accurate. So even though some of those things, and like some of the festivals like Ostara and things like that, the names of them are very recent, and like some of the practices to do with them are very recent. We're talking in the last sort of like 50 years, even though obviously things were going on that were similar to those things before that. But as Ostara, for example, it wasn't a thing until quite recently. It was only named, I believe, in the 70s, that name became popular. So it's not got a long history, but some of the festivals like Beltane do have a long history, but they're not a neo-pagan history. They are rooted in a specific cultural context, if you see what I mean. So I hope I'm explaining that well. So Beltane or Beltana is originally from the Gaelic tradition. So when people talk about the Celts, they often think about the Irish and the Scottish and the Welsh, you know, but there's also like Manx and Brittonic, and also like Iberian and things like that. So it's not quite as simple as that, but most often people will think of Irish and Scottish and sometimes Welsh as well. So as a Welsh person, Beltane is not what I celebrate because it's a specifically Gaelic tradition, and what that means is that it's celebrated by the Irish and Scottish people, and the word is an Irish, a Gaelic word, so it's like a common word, slightly different spelling and pronunciation depending on whether you're Irish or whether you're Scottish. So the customs and things which are appropriate for Beltane are often taken from the Irish and Scottish folklore, which makes a lot of sense. Although with the advent of Wicca and with neo-paganism, there have been other elements of things brought in. With the way that Gardner thought about it, with Wicca, you know, with the Wheel of the Year, with Wicca, it tells the story of the god and the goddess through the year, you know, and different things happen in their story, you know, as in like in the winter solstice, that's when the goddess gives birth to the baby god. And you know, as the story goes through the year, and then the god is getting older, and Beltane is that time where the god and the goddess, both fully mature, mate, have sex and conceive the god. He conceives himself, who'll be born later on in the year. So that is the story, that's the kind of mythology of Wicca. So in a Wiccan tradition, May Day, Beltane, has a lot of more fertility associations, which were not necessarily so specifically there in the original Gaelic, Celtic traditions. So they were there in other traditions, like in the Anglo-Saxon May traditions. Gosh, how many times am I going to say traditions? In the Anglo-Saxon folklore and customs, there are things like maypoles and stuff like that, and similar also in the Germanic, in the Walpurgisnacht traditions. There are like fertility rites, and obviously when you think about it at this time of year, what is happening around us in those climates, in those cultures. So like where I am in Wales, the climate is very similar to that of Ireland, and this is the time of year where the sun is the winner, you know. It is most definitely summer is coming, and we are ready for it. And so of course fertility is part of that, because it's the time when the flowers are kind of coming out. Lots of flowers already are out. Even the very first fruits will be starting to form, you know. So of course fertility is an aspect of it. But in the ancient, you know, sort of pre-Christian traditions in Ireland and Scotland, it wasn't so much focused on fertility, it was focused on their land-based practices and what was happening at that time. And not specifically May the 1st, it didn't have to be May the 1st, it just makes it more convenient to our modern Wheel of the Year and our modern kind of practices and stuff to like actually nail a date, because it's, you know, it's easier to arrange things when you've got a specific date. But that wouldn't have been the case hundreds of years ago. It would have been the case that, well, even thousands of years ago, it would have been that people would have been watching what was happening in nature, and when certain things were happening, that's when they knew that it was time for the May Day traditions and things that take place. And historically, it was a time when the cattle, the cows, the sheep and the goats would be moved from their winter pastures to their summer pastures. So the climate can get quite cold, especially in Scotland in the winter time. And so the people and the cattle would all have been kind of kept in a little bit closer to the villages and under cover much more. But then in the summer, they would have moved out to those more broad grassy pastures for them to graze over the summer months. And so the sort of theme of this time is a time of a transition. And that is why it's similarly to Samhain, which is the opposite festival to Beltane, and both of those festivals are traditional Gaelic festivals going back thousands of years. Like I said, not all of the Wiccan festivals are that, but those two are, and they're like kind of the opposite of each other. So at Samhain, or around that date when the nature signs were there, then the opposite would have been done. The cattle would have been brought back to the winter pastures. The people would have been setting themselves up ready for winter, which was like the new year at that time. So both of those times are a time where people say things about like the veil being thin, and lots of people say, well, what does that actually mean? And we will talk about that. In Wales, we don't say Beltane, we say Calan Mai or Calan Haf, which means the start of summer or the start of May, and it's got very much the same connotations in Wales as it does in Ireland and Scotland, but it's a little bit different in our folklore. So yeah, like I say, it's a liminal time. It's a time between, because it is a crossing over time where the cattle and the people will be moving from their winter pastures to their summer pastures. And the thing about crossing over times, thresholds, is that they can be dangerous, you know. When you think of like the two major thresholds in human life, we have birth, where we come in to this life, and we have death, where we go out of this life. And so thresholds in general are symbolic of those two huge thresholds, and threshold crossings are times when interference from spirits or fairies can be, well, same thing, can be more prominent, and I don't want to say dangerous, because I don't want to scare anybody, but that was what was thought, you know. It was a particular time where danger could come in if you didn't do the rites as they were laid out, sort of thing. So the bulk of the historical, going back thousands of years, Festival of Beltane is about purification, about safety and protection of boundaries while you are crossing over these thresholds. So the things that we associate with Beltane, like fire and like seining, as they say in Scotland, which is like purifying with smoke, these are things which were done to ensure that safe crossing, that safe threshold. So in some places the fire would be lit, the bell fires would be lit, and it'd be basically like a huge bonfire, and everyone in the villages around the bonfire would put out their own hearth fires and clean everywhere. So it's I suppose it's not spring cleaning anymore, it's kind of summer cleaning, but it's another time to have a really good purification and clean, very similar to what you might do at In Bulk. And you'd make sure that everything was clean, everything was clear, the hearth was swept, everything was clean out of the house, and not just the physical clean, but you'd make sure that any debts that you had owing, you would pay. If you had loaned anything to anybody, you'd be careful to get it back. It would be a time of making sure all the loose ends were tied up, because the thing about loose ends is that it's easy for spirits to catch onto them and then unravel things, you know. So you want to make sure everything is as watertight as possible. So that's what people would have done. They would have made sure their debts were paid, their rent was paid, their belongings were in order, their homes were in order, their farms and boundaries were all in order in preparation for this threshold crossing time. And you know, that also makes sense from a practical point of view, because sometimes the people would move from where they lived even during the winter time to live in like bothies and things in the fields with the animals over the summertime. So they may, you know, the same way as when you go on holidays, you usually kind of make sure your house is all protected. You make sure you switch off all your electric sockets and unplug things, and you know, empty food out of your fridge and things like that. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. It's thinking about preparation for moving into a new space. And so, like I said, yeah, the bell fires would be lit. The community would gather around the fires, and there would be different traditions according to where you lived. In Scotland, they would often make bannocks, which are kind of like bread rolls, a bit flatter than that, but you know, they'd make bannocks, and there were different traditions where they would have certain like like lumps, kind of knobs on the top of the bannocks, and they would turn their back on the bellfires and pull one of the knobs off and say like, this is for protection against this, and they'd throw it over their shoulder into the fire and things like that. And people would do those things in order to protect their livestock and their family and things like that, because, you know, at that time that was their life. You know, if your cattle got sick and it like spread through your herd, that could be death for your family. You know, it is very different from how things are now. And so I find it is helpful when you are trying to figure out, well, what does this time mean for me, and how can I celebrate at this time? Think about what is actually happening for you, and what was happening for the people who originally started this festival, and pull on those threads of similarities, and then you can find a way which is like authentic and which is meaningful, because that's the whole point. You know, we don't just celebrate these things for no reason. We do the things, the rites at the certain times, because if we don't, bad stuff can happen. That's what the ancients believed. People don't tend to sort of be so doom and gloom about it these days now. And also, like, unless you do those things and you prepare in that way, then the wheel cannot continue to turn. And so it was important to do those things in order to keep things going as they are meant to be, you know, in that right motion is continuing. So I'm jumping around a little bit, but I hope that this is, you know, making sense and is interesting. I find it really interesting. I love reading about the folklore and the customs. If you're interested actually in old Scottish folklore, there's a brilliant book called the Comina Gadelica, which it was collected, I think, in the 17th century, so it's not like super old, but there was like a guy who went around collecting stories and folklore and bits of charms and things like that from the Scottish people during that time, and it's, you know, it's really fascinating. We have something sort of similar in Wales. It's not really quite the same, but it's the Physicians of Myddfai, and it's like charms and healing potions and things like that, which have been used for centuries. You know, I find things like that really fascinating. You might not, you know, you might just be interested in doing the more modern practices, but even with the more modern practices, it's good to know where the roots of those are, because, you know, if you don't know where the roots are, you can't water them. So yeah, let's go back to the bellfire and casting our bannock bits into the fire as we're saying this is for fox, or this is for safety of my cattle, this is for safety of my family, things like that, you know. And sometimes they would have two fires rather than one fire, and they would actually drive the cattle between the fires so that they would be kind of, you know, again, we're talking thresholds, we're talking gateways, and going through that symbolic threshold and getting covered in the smoke of between the two fires was very purifying. And people used to also jump the flames, sometimes when it was fully lit, sometimes after the fire had died down, people would jump over the ashes. What else? People would collect the ashes sometimes and take them home with them as well, and use them then as like a boundary charm, so that you go around your property and sprinkle a little of the ash all the way around your own threshold as a way of marking that threshold out. So that's something that can be used in our modern day practice as well. If you do have a bonfire somewhere for Beltane, or, you know, it doesn't, not a bonfire, it could just be like a fire pit fire or something like that outside, or even something small inside. You know, sometimes, like, you might light a small fire in like a cauldron with salt at the bottom and use it in a symbolic way. You might generate like a small bit of ash that you could then symbolically sprinkle or mix with water and just sprinkle around your property. So what are we doing? Why are we doing these things? Well, it's because of that idea of threshold crossing, boundaries, and at this time that is what we want to be doing. We want to be sanctifying our boundaries, we want to be purifying and protecting our boundaries. And you might be thinking, well, what has this got to do with like the kind of things that we tend to hear about more at this time, like the fertility type stuff and all the sexy stuff? And yeah, not a lot, some, you know, in a sense, but also it is still got that kind of idea, because obviously coupling with another is also to do with boundaries and things like that as well. But for the Gaelic Celts, it wasn't so much a kind of sexy time as a moving from one time to another, you know, one space to another space. And obviously when things are moving and things are in flux, then there's more risk of danger, like we've already talked about, but there's also more opportunity for meeting new people, you know, and for things to happen. So there is an aspect of it there, but it's not as much so in the very ancient celebrations as it is. It's become much more prominent now in our more modern celebrations. And like lots of people still do things like make bannocks and have balfires and things like that, because to honour the traditions that have passed. Something else that people would do then is that they would light a branch from the fire, and they would take that fire lit like a torch back to their homes, and they would light their own hearth fire then with the Belfire, because the Belfire was lucky. There's not a consensus about what Beltane actually means. From the kind of the words and the etymology of the words, it probably means something like bright fire or lucky fire, although some people think that it was associated with one of the old Brythonic gods, which are like one of the ancient gods of Britain before the Celts, and into Celtic times too, called Belisama. But it's tenuous sometimes. You know, we don't really know. In Welsh, the word for fire is tarn, so it does, and in the Irish word for fire, ten, is similar. So you know, you can see the why Beltane and the fire associations are really really prominent. So yeah, the people would have taken that lucky fire and taken it home and lit their own hearth fires with that as well, and that would have been a very symbolic new start with that new fire for the next 12 months, you know, until the next time, or I suppose until Samhain, and then obviously the next 6 months as well. But the way that they thought about time is probably very different from how we think about time now. I've talked a lot about fire, and this festival is very much a fire festival from its ancient past. But water, the kind of opposite of fire, is also very special at this time. And the blog post which I'm going to share with you this month, it kind of goes a little bit more into that, and has a special thing for you to make using the special Beltane water. But just as a kind of general thing, the first water of Beltane, like from a well or from a pump, or you know, even now from the tap, was considered to be blessed, and if you had access to that water, then that also conferred luck on you in that same way as the fire. So there were huge feuds sometimes between families, because often there were obviously wells and springs which people would get their water from, but unless you were like a very rich family who had a lot of land, you wouldn't necessarily have one of those on your land, so they would fall often on common ground. And so families would sometimes like sort of kind of camp close to the wells, and like in different traditions, different folklore and stories, it says like as soon as the midnight has passed on the night of Beltane, on Beltane Eve, so like from the end of April to the beginning, from the 30th of April, the evening, on midnight, that's when the water had the special properties. But for some it was at dawn on May the 1st, and in some folklore it's the whole month of May where the water has this special property. So the fire and the water, and you know, that also makes sense as well, because we think of fire as being like purifying, smoke as being purifying, but then water also is very cleansing, very purifying too. And so those properties of both of those things combined almost makes like a kind of fire water, a full cleanse, a kind of spiritual and emotional cleanse, because the fire is working on that spiritual cleansing and the water is working on that kind of emotional cleansing as well. So other things you might want to do at this time are things like ritual bathing. You know, you might want to make yourself a special bath where you can symbolically cleanse anything that you don't want to take with you as you cross this threshold into the new time. And like I did say, I was going to talk a little bit about the veil, and in Welsh we say ysbryd nos, spirit night, and May Day and Samhain, Beltane and Samhain are both spirit nights because they are those crossing over times. And so they would have traditionally been very good times for divination, because that information, the worldview of the Celts was the other world. It wasn't at all like, you know, heaven, us, hell. It wasn't, you know, that's a Christian worldview, and it wasn't something that the Celts originally had. Although lots of Celts obviously converted to Christianity, and there is a kind of very strong, especially in Wales, association of Christianity. It kind of melded in a way to some of the indigenous traditions. And in that sense as well, like when you look at the Catholic tradition for May, it is a month of celebrating Mary, the Holy Mother, and her kind of life-giving properties is probably not the right word to ascribe to the Holy Mother, but it's even though, you know, in the Christian sense they see her as quite differently, she was quite easily understood by the Celts because they had those kind of mother goddesses already in their tradition, and so it would have made sense to them for Mary to be prominent at this time. She's a protector. She ensures safe crossing of thresholds. You know, that's why in the Hail Mary you ask her to pray for us now and as we pass, you know, when we pass over. So prayers, you know, Christian prayers at this time as well, if you're a Christian, are also totally appropriate. And that's something I wanted to kind of talk about, is making this time make sense for you. So if you are in a very hot country or a very wet country where the kind of traditional, if the kind of Wiccan stuff doesn't make sense to you at this time, then look into what would have been the tradition in that land, in that place where you are. And you know, that can raise some issues with things like appropriation and stuff like that, because if you are like the descender of somebody who has colonized another place, then it can be difficult to approach that in a sensitive way. But we're all humans, we've all been indigenous to a place, and for us to feel rooted and connected with each other and with nature, it's important, I feel, for us to feel rooted and be planted in the land where we are. So finding out the stories of that land and the customs of that land, not in a culturally appropriative way, just in a reverential, learning, respectful way, and then seeing what you and your own heritage then can bring to that. And so you can create your own customs, and you might want to create your own customs involving fire, because obviously Beltane, fire, and perhaps with water. You might want to bring in some kind of element of ritual purification. You might want to bring in a symbolic element of crossing. You might want to think about offerings like the bannocks, you know, so you're offering to the spirits for protection and to your ancestors for protection as you cross this threshold. It's a really wonderful time to, if you've been feeling like you do want a fresh start, then it's a really wonderful time for that, because each of these spirit north, you know, each of these crossing over threshold times, when you leave, you can leave stuff behind. You don't have to carry everything with you that you've been carrying. And so, you know, as a lovely ritual and very simple could be to take like a bath or a shower and think about cleansing yourself, and then perhaps lighting incense and using it to cleanse yourself also with the incense. And then something really simple like just writing down some things which you really, really value about yourself. And putting them perhaps like in an envelope, or if you have like a deity that you work with who supports you, or you know, ancestors who support you, and putting that where you have a space for them, if you've got an altar space, something like that. And then writing things which you don't want to take with you, that you want to leave behind. And they might be personal things, they might be things that have been going on in your family, kind of like ancestral things going on for a long time. You can write those things down, and then you can burn those things in the bell fire. So you know, that might just be like literally a candle in something safe to burn around, you know. You can use like a big saucepan and put sand or salt in the bottom of it, and just put a tea light in there, and you can safely burn things over that. Or if you can get outside and light a fire pit, something like that, you can cast those things in there. And at the same time, then you might want to also give offerings to, you know, it never hurts. Offerings have kind of fallen out of favour with people because it's not, although I think this is changing, but we went through a phase definitely in craft where it wasn't kind of cool to have a devotional practice or kind of devotional connection, because it's kind of more common now to even to be an atheist or to work with deity only as archetype. And you know, and that's totally fine. I think you're wrong if you think that, but you know, we all have our own paths and we all have our own kind of wisdoms and learnings. And so offerings have kind of fallen out of favour, because if you don't have a devotional path, then it seems weird to make offerings. People don't really know what to do with them. It's like, well, what do I do with this after, and stuff like that, you know. So but why not? You know, you can try it and see how it goes, see how it feels. And some people, like, instead of actually making physical offerings, like you might want to do the whole kind of bannock thing and toss it in, or make something like a rowan cross, where you can use 2 sticks of the rowan and sort of put red thread between them, things like that. There's lots of like little customs and things like that that you can look into. And like I said, you might be better off looking into what is native for you rather than what is native to the Scottish and Irish people 2,000 years ago, or what was like made sense to the creator of Wicca 50s, 60s, 70 almost now years ago, you know. Just because something happened then doesn't mean it's still relevant now, and at the same time, just because it happened a long time ago doesn't mean it's not relevant now. But it's being discerning and kind of figuring out like what is and what isn't, which is fun, and it's part of the process, it's part of the way of carving your own path. You might have traditions from a different religion which happened at this time of year that makes sense to you, and you can most definitely weave those things in. There's no rule that says, there's no rule. There's no rule. You choose according to your own inner compass what is the right thing for you to do, and you will be let know, especially with things like offerings, if you did the right thing, because if you did, then good things happen. So what was I saying? I was talking about offerings. You can obviously leave physical offerings like the bannock, or you could put flowers on your altar, or you could put you can offer incense, or you can offer food and drink, things like that. Especially if you've got like an ancestral practice or an ancestral altar, you would offer things that would be appreciated by your ancestors. You know, if they liked a particular alcoholic or non-alcoholic drink, or if they liked a particular food, things like that, then you could offer those things. But if you feel uncomfortable making physical offerings like that, because like people are a bit like, well, when do I take them away? What do I do with them after I remove them, and things like that? You can offer in other ways. So you could perhaps like make a donation to charity instead, especially a charity that would kind of like make sense at this time, or like with the themes. So like when you're talking about like a threshold purification kind of thing, and like the dangers of crossing over thresholds, then perhaps a charity that supported birth or death, or transitions of other kinds, like perhaps like homelessness, things like that as well. It'd be good to look into that and see if there's anything that kind of resonates with you, and you could make an offering, a financial offering to that charity, or a time offering as well. You know, you can give time as well. That is very, very valuable and valued by the spirits and the gods. So So yeah. This was supposed to be a half-hour video, which it is, and it seems to have absolutely flown by, and hopefully it made sense and wasn't too much here, there and everywhere. I love to talk about the kind of festivals, like I say, and the folklore and the history and everything associated with it. If you enjoyed my ramblings, you might want to check out my YouTube channel, which is I'm Jessica Starr, the Story Witch on YouTube. I'm also an author, and you can find out more on my website as well, which is thestorywitch.com. Thank you so much for watching. Have a blessed Beltane. Look out for my article, which will become my blog post, which will be coming out in the next, well, at sometime this month. It's been really lovely to share some space with you, and I hope that your Beltane celebrations are authentic for you and poignant, and that you cross the threshold and leave everything that you no longer wish to take with you behind. Beltane blessings.